Later, the pilot of an F-51 was flying at 20,000 feet, about 40 miles south of Muroc Air Base, when he sighted a flat object of a light reflecting nature. He reported that it had no vertical fin or wings. When he first saw it, the object was above him, and he tried to climb up to it, but his F-51 would not climb high enough. All air bases in the area were contacted, but they had no aircraft in the area. By the end of July 1947, the UFO security lid was down tight. The few members of the press who did inquire about what the Air Force was doing got the same treatment that you would get today if you inquired about the number of thermonuclear weapons stockpiled in the U.S.'s atomic arsenal. No one, outside of a few high-ranking officers in the Pentagon, knew what the people in the barbed wire enclosed Quonset huts that housed the Air Technical Intelligence Center were thinking or doing. The memos and correspondence that Project Blue Book inherited from the old UFO projects told the story of the early flying saucer era. These memos and pieces of correspondence showed that the UFO situation was considered to be serious. In fact, very serious. The paperwork of that period also indicated the confusion that surrounded the investigation. Confusion almost to the point of panic. The brass wanted an answer, quickly, and people were taking off in all directions. Everyone's theory was as good as the next, and each person with any weight at ATIC was plugging and investigating his own theory. The ideas as to the origin of the UFOs fall into two main categories: earthly and non-earthly. In the earthly category, the Russians led, with the U.S. Navy and their XF-5U-1, the Flying Flapjack, pulling a not-too-close second. The desire to cover all leads was graphically pointed up to be a personal handwritten note I found in a file. It was from ATIC's chief to a civilian intelligence specialist. It said, "Are you positive that the Navy junked the XF-5U-1 project?" The non-earthly category ran the gamut of theories, with space animals trailing interplanetary craft about the same distance the Navy was behind the Russians. This confused speculating lasted only a few weeks. Then the investigation narrowed down to the Soviets and took off on a much more methodical course of action. When World War II ended, the Germans had several radical types of aircraft and guided missiles under development. The majority of these projects were in the most preliminary stages, but they were the only known craft that could even approach the performance of the objects reported by UFO observers. Like the Allies, after World War II, the Soviets had obtained complete sets of data on the latest German developments. This, coupled with rumors that the Soviets were frantically developing the German ideas, caused no small degree of alarm. As more UFOs were observed near the Air Force's Muroc Test Center, the Army's White Sands Proving Ground, and atomic bomb plants, ATIC's efforts began. Wires were sent to intelligence agents in Germany requesting that they find out exactly how much progress had been made on the various German projects. The last possibility, of course, was that the Soviets had discovered some completely new aerodynamic concept that would give saucer performance. While ATIC technical analysts were scouring the United States for data on the German projects, and the intelligence agents in Germany were seeking out the data they had been asked for, UFO reports continued to flood the country. The Pacific Northwest still led with the most sightings, but every state in the Union was reporting a few flying saucers. At first, there was no coordinated effort to collect data on the UFO reports. Leads would come from radio reports or newspaper items. Military intelligence agencies outside of ATIC were hesitant to investigate on their own initiative because, as is so typical of the military, they lacked specific orders. When no orders were forthcoming, they took this to mean that the military had no interest in the UFOs. But before long, this placid attitude changed, and changed drastically. Classified orders came down to investigate all UFO sightings. Get every detail and send it direct to ATIC at Wright Field. The order carried no explanation as to why the information was wanted. This lack of an explanation, and the fact that the information was to be sent directly to a high-powered intelligence group within Air Force headquarters, stirred the imagination of every potential cloak and dagger man in the military intelligence system. Intelligence people in the field, who had previously been free with opinions, now clammed up tight. The era of confusion was progressing. Early statements to the press, which shaped the opinion of the public, didn't reduce the confusion factor. While ATIC was grimly expending maximum effort in a serious study, certain high-placed officials were officially chuckling at the mention of UFOs. In July 1947, an international news service wire story quoted the public relations officer at Wright Field as saying, "So far, we haven't found anything to confirm that saucers exist. We don't think they are guided missiles." He went on to say, "As things are now, they appear to be either a phenomenon or a figment of somebody's imagination." A few weeks later, a lieutenant colonel who was assistant to the chief of staff of the 4th Air Force was widely quoted as saying, "There is no basis for belief in flying saucers in the Tacoma area," referring to a UFO sighting in the area of Tacoma, Washington, "or any other area." The experts, in their stories of saucer lore, have said that these brush-offs of the UFO sightings were intentional smokescreens to cover the facts by adding confusion. This is not true. It was merely a lack of coordination. But had the Air Force tried to throw up a screen of confusion, they couldn't have done a better job. When the lieutenant colonel from the 4th Air Force made his widely publicized denunciation of saucer believers, he specifically mentioned a UFO report from the Tacoma, Washington area. The report of the investigation of this incident, the Maury Island mystery, was one of the most detailed reports of the early UFO era. The report that we had in our files had been pieced together by Air Force intelligence and other agencies because the 2 intelligence officers who started the investigation couldn't finish it. They were dead. For the Air Force, the story started on July 31, 1947, when Lieutenant Frank Brown, an intelligence agent at Hamilton Air Force Base, California, received a long-distance phone call. The caller was a man whom 111 calls Simpson, who had met Brown when Brown investigated an earlier UFO sighting, and he had a hot lead on another UFO incident. He had just talked to 2 Tacoma Harbor patrolmen. One of them had seen 6 UFOs hover over his patrol boat and spew out chunks of odd metal. Simpson had some of the pieces of the metal. The story sounded good to Lieutenant Brown, so he reported it to his chief. His chief okayed a trip, and within an hour, Lieutenant Brown and Captain Davidson were flying to Tacoma in an Air Force B-25. When they arrived, they met Simpson and an airline pilot friend of his in Simpson's hotel room. After the usual round of introductions, Simpson told Brown and Davidson that he had received a letter from a Chicago publisher asking him, Simpson, to investigate this case. The publisher had paid him $200 and wanted an exclusive on the story. but things were getting too hot. Simpson wanted the military to take over. Simpson went on to say that he had heard about the experience off Maury Island, but that he wanted Brown and Davidson to hear it firsthand. He had called the 2 harbor patrolmen, and they were on their way to the hotel. They arrived, and they told their story. I'll call these 2 men Jackson and Richards, although these aren't their real names. In June 1947, Jackson said, his crew, his son, and the son's dog were on his patrol boat patrolling near Maury Island, an island in Puget Sound, about 3 miles from Tacoma. It was a gray day with a solid cloud deck down at about 2,500 feet. 6 donut-shaped objects just under the clouds, headed toward the boat. They came closer and closer, and when they were about 500 feet over the boat, they stopped. One of the donut-shaped objects seemed to be in trouble, as the other 5 were hovering around it. They were close, and everybody got a good look. The UFOs were about 100 feet in diameter, with the hole in the donut being about 25 feet in diameter. They were a silver color and made absolutely no noise. Each object had large portholes around the edge. As the 5 UFOs circled the 6th, Jackson recalled, one of them came in and appeared to make contact with the disabled craft. The 2 objects maintained contact for a few minutes, then began to separate. While this was going on, Jackson was taking photos. Just as they began to separate, there was a dull thud, and the next second the UFO began to spew out sheets of very light metal from a hole in the center. As these were fluttering to the water, the UFO began to throw out a harder, rock-like material. Some of it landed on the beach of Maury Island. Jackson took his crew and headed toward the beach of Maury Island, but not before the boat was damaged. His son's arm had been injured, and the dog killed. As they reached the island, they looked up and saw that the UFOs were leaving the area at high speed. The harbor patrolman went on to tell how he scooped up several chunks of the metal from the beach and boarded the patrol boat. He tried to use his radio to summon aid, but for some unusual reason, the interference was so bad he couldn't even call the 3 miles to his headquarters in Tacoma. When they docked at Tacoma, Jackson got first aid for his son and then reported to his superior officer, Richard, who, Jackson added to his story, didn't believe the tale. He didn't believe it until he went out to the island himself and saw the metal. Jackson's trouble wasn't over. The next morning, a mysterious visitor told Jackson to forget what he'd seen. Later that same day, the photos were developed. They showed the 6 objects, but the film was badly spotted and fogged, as if the film had been exposed to some kind of radiation. Then Simpson told about his brush with mysterious callers. He said that Jackson was not alone as far as mysterious callers were concerned. The Tacoma newspapers had been getting calls from an anonymous tipster telling exactly what was going on in Simpson's